Hello everybody. Last fall, I visited the Bacardí Bottling Plant designed by Félix Candela between 1958 and 1961, just a little bit outside of Mexico City. And here are some of my thoughts on the building. Although this is a space of large-scale industrial production, the architecture does not read as exclusively industrial. What struck me immediately was how flexible the building feels typologically. It operates simultaneously across several categories at once: industrial, infrastructural, institutional, and even religious. The building behaves partly like a factory, but also like an airport terminal, a museum, a sports field, or a cathedral nave. What all these building types share in common is a structural ambition: the long span. At a certain scale, all these architectural typologies attempt to solve the same problem: how to cover the maximum amount of space with the minimum amount of structural interruption. Candela's body of work consistently achieves structural likeness. His buildings are defined by thin shell concrete hyperbolic paraboloids, a doubly curved surface generated from straight lines. Structurally, these shells distribute force across the curvature rather than concentrating loads onto isolated columns. In many ways, the history of architecture can be read as a history of the structural engineering of long spans. Early post and lintel systems were constrained by the tensile limitations of stone and timber. As the length of spans increased, structural failures occurred. Inventions like arches, vaults, domes, trusses, flying buttresses, spans to get longer, lighter, and require fewer compression points in between. Each idea represented ways to overcome gravity while producing larger, uninterrupted interiors. Long span is therefore not only an engineering problem, it is also a spatial one. Columns are useful structurally, but spatially disruptive. They interrupt movement, visibility, workflow, and flexibility. However, once the span reaches a certain length, the interior stops behaving like a sequence of rooms, instead like a continuous field. At the Bacardí Bottling Plant, the concrete shell module repeat rhythmically across the site in a 2x3 grid. Each vault is only a few centimeters thick. The result is an open interior capable of accommodating industrial production with extraordinary programmatic flexibility. Forklifts circulate freely. Bottling lines can expand or contract. Let's compare this typology to other building types. This is where we ask again, what other typologies can this building be? First, let's compare the factory warehouse to a museum. What is a museum if not an extremely nice storage unit? Sculptures, artifacts, and other assortments of man-made objects are temporarily parked in a meticulously organized fashion against an immaculately constructed backdrop. Structural interruption therefore limits curatorial flexibility. The same logic of exhibition design applies to industrial production and storage of a factory. Here, at the Bacardí Bottling Plant, the clarity of workflow has to be visible at a glance. The sequence of operation, from aging to bottling, needs to be well-labeled, well-positioned, easy to access, and easy to read. There's an institutional quality to this industrial architecture, a factory that runs just like a museum. Let's also compare the bottling plant to a sports facility. Warehouses and athletic fields both depend on uninterrupted surfaces. Basketball courts, soccer fields, tennis courts all rely on rules of the sports articulated with lines. These lines allow us to define the limits of how the human body can run, throw, jump, kick, or block at very measurable dimensions. Here, at the Bacardí Bottling Plant, the graphic evidence of workflow is drawn as overlaying lines of choreography, a choreography of work. Forklift circulation and its predictable turning radii becomes part of the athletic field of machines moving with humans, a logistical dance of economic production. Lastly, let's think about the similarities between this Candela project and the Catholic Church. Mexico has a specific Catholic tradition that is deeply embedded within the day-to-day life of the workers. Although Candela's building is entirely secular, certain spatial qualities still resemble a space of mass congregation. The repetitious structural bays produce a nave-like rhythm. Light filters softly across the curved concrete surface like the vaults of a cathedral. Akin to a basilica, the routines of the workers cut through the axial lengths of the span, while reminded of the highly visible exits and entries glimmering with the hopes of outside life. This is why I think Candela, whose ability to produce shockingly advanced and lightweight structural system for his time, builds beyond typologies. Factories, museums, sports fields, airports, churches. We are no longer talking about form follows function. No, this is structure begetting programs. What becomes equally striking to me during this visit, however, was not the roof itself, but the envelope. Candela crops the edge of the shell structure and caps the open frames with glass. At the Bacardí Bottling Plant, the perimeter glass envelope is not always seamless. One senses moments where ideal geometry collides with practical necessity, and how the glass had to be cut in awkward curves in order to accommodate the shell. This places Candela within a much longer lineage of architects and engineers who treated structure as the generator of form. Antonio Gaudí developed catenary systems in projects such as Sagrada Familia, allowing gravity to define geometry, or take Frei Otto, for example, who pushes the trajectory in projects like Munich Olympic Stadium, where compression gives way to tension. Candela occupies an interesting middle position between these two figures. His architecture behaves almost like a solidified, stretched fabric. The more recent parallels would include Toyoto's National Taichung Theater or Sana's Rolex Learning Center. I was in Mexico with architect Ruri Nishizawa, who was very much inspired by the structural prowess of Félix Candela. Additionally, I had amazing conversations with architects Cristina Diaz Moreno and Efrain Garcia Grinda from the architecture office amid Cerro Nueve about the architectural effects of long span in Candela's work. Standing inside of the Bacardí Bottling Plant, this project is a complex mixture of typologies. Yes, a factory, not a sports field, not an airport, not a museum, and kind of a cathedral. A demonstration of how thin shell structure can support such a degree of variety. These are my first impressions of Félix Candela's Bacardí Bottling Plant. Special shout out to Instituto Español de Arquitectura in Mexico City, organized by Jesus Rubio and Cynthia de Jesus, who invited me to be a part of the Félix Candela Award jury process last fall. I also got to meet many brilliant architects, learning about the contemporary practices in Mexico and Latin America at large today. If there's another building you'd like us to review, please comment below and let us know. If you like this video, please consider a like, share, or subscribe. My name is Jimenez Lai, and remember, structural long spans can make every junk space come to life, even turning factories into cathedrals.